Lion in the Wind, Chapter 31. Fergant walked around the corner and stared in surprise as he spotted Oik and his men standing over the body of Black. He looked down and saw blood oozing from Black's head. "Is he dead?" he asked. "No, he's alive, unfortunately. But he won't be waking up anytime soon. Our little friend over here made sure of that," said Oik. Fergant looked over at Brakeman, who was leaning against a wall and sobbing bitterly. "What happened?" he asked. "I don't know. Brakeman and his droids were here when we arrived, but he hasn't said anything to us yet. Well, we need to get Mr. Black down to the Major. One of my men is reporting that the Yigzan army is sending reinforcements this way. If they get here before we sort this out, it could greatly complicate things." "Agreed." Oik then had his men pick up Black and Brakeman and carry them off the roof and down to the ground below. Delgra turned to his radio operator and asked, "How soon till the reinforcements are here?" "Another few minutes, sir." "That's what you said 10 minutes ago." The radio operator shrugged. "That's all I know, sir. I'm just going on what they told me." "I think they're lost," said Odivian. "Yeah, wouldn't that just be our luck?" groaned Delgra. He then studied the facility before them, but didn't like what he was seeing. Although the fighting had slackened, the battle was still very difficult, and each foot of gain was bitterly contested. The part he hated the most was how spread out his men had become. He'd been forced to do this in order to prevent Black's men from flanking him. They had already tried that several times. If nothing else, he had to give Black a lot of credit. He did a very good job preparing the defenses of his facility. In fact, a little too well. Then, just as he was contemplating his next move, something strange happened. The battlefield suddenly grew quiet. He peered over top of the concrete barrier he was hiding behind and noticed that Black's men had stopped fighting and were looking around in confusion. Some began to come out with their hands over their heads while others talked and argued amongst themselves. Soon his ears were greeted by a voice that he knew all too well. "Lay down your arms. We have your boss." "Lay down your arms," came the voice. As they drew closer, Black's men began surrendering en masse. "What in the name of the ancients?" muttered Delgra. "Well now, isn't that a sight?" said Odivian as he spotted the men approaching. Delgra quickly realized who it was and began to grin. "Why, those crazy old fools," he said in amazement. Odivian laughed. "Looks like they bagged Black before we did. Well then, all we need to do now is mop up his men and our work here is done." Oik and Fergant's men soon reached Delgra, and then placed their unconscious and bleeding captive at his feet. "By the gates of Tursar." "What happened to him?" said Delgra as he studied Black's wounds. "We think this little guy got a hold of him before we did," said Oik as he pointed at Brakeman. Suddenly, a lion came crashing through one of the nearby buildings followed by Garmek. The robot reached out with his tentacles to attack him, but missed as the lion quickly retreated. Some of the Yigzan soldiers nearby began firing at Garmek. But their bullets simply ricocheted off its armor. "Wait! Cease fire! Let the lions deal with him." "Your bullets have no effect," shouted Delgra. The men lowered their weapons and watched anxiously, knowing they could do nothing to help. Chigani sat down briefly as he carefully checked his systems. He was shaken, but didn't appear to have suffered any damage. "Chigani! You all right?" shouted Itika as she raced around the side of the building towards him followed by Pen. "I'm fine. Just a little shook up," said Chigani. Pen stopped next to him and faced Garmek. "We need to do something about those tentacles, or we're gonna get killed," he said as he studied Garmek. He then looked to his left at the large group of soldiers watching in awe, and spotted Odivian standing nearby holding his sniper rifle. "I've got it," he said. "Sergeant, this is Pen. Can you hear me?" he said over the radio. "I hear you," replied Odivian. "You see the robot we're fighting?" "Yeah. What do you need me to do?" The three lions leapt out of the way as Garmek lashed out at them with its tentacles. "Can you take out his tentacles?" said Pen. Odivian studied the 8 long tentacles that sprouted out of the droid's back. "Yeah, I got it," he replied. He then took aim at Garmek's back and fired, the round slicing through one of the tentacles like a hot knife through butter. The tentacle convulsed wildly, and then crashed to the ground as hydraulic fluid poured out of it like a fountain. Garmek turned in Odivian's direction and glared at him. Odivian chambered another round, and then realized that he was now the center of Garmek's attention. He swore. Garmek began to fire its rocket engines as Chigani leapt at the droid. "Keep him busy until the sergeant can get all those tentacles," shouted Chigani over the radio. The other 2 lions jumped at Garmek, but were quickly batted aside. However, their attack had achieved its desired effect. Garmek shut down its rocket engines and again turned its attention toward the lions. Odivian fired again, the second bullet cutting through 2 more of Garmek's tentacles. More fluid gushed from the severed tentacles. They writhed wildly for several moments, and then went limp and slumped to the ground. Soon the rest of the tentacles fell limp as well. Garmek stared down at them and grunted in disgust. It reached back and ripped them from its body as hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere. It then threw them to the side and charged at the lions. Odivian's rifle thundered again, but this time the round ricocheted harmlessly off the droid's thick body armor. He swore. "Keep firing, Sergeant," said Delgra. "I can't. The droid is too well armored. They're going to have to strip away part of its protection before I can do anything more." Delgra looked at the droid and began to become concerned. Just then Welk, Sims and a caravan of Yigzan soldiers arrived. They looked over at the large group of prisoners sitting on the ground nearby, and then at Garmek. "Looks like we missed the party," said Welk. "Not entirely, Sergeant. Get these prisoners out of here. Then help us sweep the facility for the rest of Black's men." "What about that thing?" asked Welk as he pointed towards Garmek. "The lions will have to deal with him." Welk nodded and then noticed Oik and Fergant's men. He pointed to them, and asked, "What are they doing here?" "They're allies of ours. Give them a ride out of here too. They've done a lot to help us today," said Delbra. Welk nodded, and then saluted. "Yes, sir. And Sergeant, I need some of your LAVs." "We didn't bring any," said Welk. Delgra cursed. "See if you can't round some up. We're going to need them." "Yes, sir." Chigani studied Garmek cautiously. Without the tentacles, the droid would be easier to fight. But how easy remained to be seen. Chigani charged at Garmek and then sidestepped to his left. Pen and Itika studied him for a moment trying to figure out what he was doing, and then realized what his strategy was. When Garmek had ripped out its tentacles and had created a crack in the armored plates on its back. Pen grinned with devilish glee. "All right, it's playtime." He then rushed at Garmek, leapt onto its back and began slashing at the cracked armor. Garmek stumbled backwards and tried desperately to reach Pen. But the lion adeptly avoided its grasp as he fought to widen the breach in the droid's armor. Itika tried to join him, but was caught in Garmek's strong grasp and hurled into a nearby retaining wall. She crashed through the wall, tumbled for a ways, and then lay still. "Itika!" shouted Chigani over the radio. But she didn't respond. Pen, realizing he was next, leapt clear of Garmek's grasp and backflipped to the ground. He then raced in Itika's direction followed by Chigani. She struggled awkwardly to her feet as the 2 lions appeared at her side. "You alright?" asked Chigani. She nodded slowly. "I'm functional, but I got banged up pretty badly. I can still fight though." Chigani visually scanned her body. "Alright, but be careful. I can see cracks in your body shell. You won't be able to take much more abuse," he said. She nodded. "I'll be alright." Garmek then began to walk their way as the 3 lions lined up, and then charged at the droid. Chigani and Pen leapt onto Garmek's chest as Itika flanked around and leapt at its back. But Garmek knew that she was there and spun just as she jumped, driving a powerful blow into her chest. She sailed backwards and crashed through a nearby building, tumbled to a stop, and then lay still. Chigani could see smoke oozing from her shattered body shell. "Inika!" he shouted over the radio. But this time he knew she would not be getting back up. He turned his anger towards Garmek and began attacking its face. Garmek grabbed Chigani and tossed him in the air. Chigani tried to catch himself, but could not. He hit the ground hard and skid to a stop. He then got up and watched as Pen flipped over Garmek's shoulders and attacked its back again. Chigani rushed at Garmek and threw the full weight of his body against the giant robot's chest. Garmek stumbled briefly, and then caught itself. It then drove a powerful punch into Chigani's chest. The lion's eyes went wide as he felt his body shell crack under the force of the blow. He tumbled through the air and crashed to the ground. Pen hooked his claws into the robot and threw his weight back, pulling Garmek off balance. He then leapt clear as the droid collapsed to the ground with a thud. Chigani quickly picked himself up and examined his body. He was injured, but he could still fight. Pen raced towards Garmek and leapt into the air. But to his surprise, Garmek had anticipated his attack. It reached up and snatched the lion out of the air and then tossed him towards a nearby wall. But Pen reacted quickly and was able to use a nearby lamp post to slow his flight. He then righted himself, landed on all 4 feet, and skid to a halt. Garmek turned towards him and glared at the lion. Pen ignored this and hurried over to check on Chigani. "You all right?" he asked. Chigani nodded. "I'll last for the rest of the battle," he said. Seeing that both lions were together, Garmek fired its rocket motors and raced towards them. Pen realized it almost too late as Garmek zeroed in on Chigani. He immediately turned and shoved Chigani out of the path of the giant robot. But that brave deed cost him dearly as Garmek slammed into him like a sledgehammer. The 2 droids flew together for a short ways before crashing through a nearby retaining wall. Garmek slowly picked itself up off the ground, and then kicked probingly at Pen's broken body as it lay on the ground at its feet. It then turned its attention to Chigani, who now stood in a state of mixed shock and anger. Garmek again fired its rockets and charged at the lion. But Chigani wasn't going to be attacked the same way twice. He waited until Garmek was almost on top of him and then leapt into the air. The surprised robot flew under him and continued on as Chigani reached out and grabbed at the large crack in the droid's armor. As his claws hooked into it, he was yanked out of the air and dragged along with the droid as it careened across the ground towards a nearby building. Chigani planted his feet on Garmek's back, pulled himself free, and then leapt clear of the droid with all his might. This caused Garmek to bury its head into the ground, and then flip end over end, smashing through 2 trucks and a nearby building before vanishing in a cloud of fire and smoke. Chigani landed on the ground and studied the smoldering damage path left by the droid. Several moments later Garmek reappeared, its mangled chest plate hanging awkwardly from its body. It reached across, ripped it off, and then tossed it away. Chigani studied this curiously, and then blinked in surprise as he realized that all of Garmek's inner workings were now exposed to attack. Garmek soon began walking towards him, a noticeable limp in its step. Seeing his opportunity, Chigani raced towards the droid at full speed, skid to a stop at its feet, and then feigned right. Garmek reached out where it thought Chigani was going, only to discover that the lion was not there as it expected. It quickly turned back to Chigani just as the lion lunged at its chest and began to slash wildly, quickly decimating its now unprotected circuitry. Garmek flinched, and then began to convulse wildly as Chigani continued to ravage the robot's internal circuitry as he fought against what he felt was his inevitable demise. Even if he could not kill Garmek, he could at least give the others a fighting chance to defeat the droid. Suddenly his eyes were filled with a blinding white light, and then total blackness. He felt nothing, heard nothing, and saw nothing for several moments. When his senses finally did return, he was horrified to discover that he could barely move. His mind immediately turned to Garmek. He searched frantically with his eyes for the robot and soon found its shattered, burning body lying on the ground not far away. A feeling of relief swept over Chigani. He didn't know how he'd done it, but he'd defeated Garmek. He closed his eyes and sighed happily as his senses began to fade away again. But just then he thought he could hear Welk and Sims racing towards him, screaming his name. He tried to open his eyes, but found that he couldn't. More of his systems began to fail. He was dying and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Just then his mind wandered back to thoughts of Dr. Bergen and Persia as his body slowly gave up the fight. He smiled within himself, and thought, I've won. Everyone will be safe now. Come home, Chigani, came a soft, sweet voice in his mind. Washwa, he thought in surprise. There's someone here who wants to see you, said the voice kindly. Who? Asked Chigani. Your mom and dad. Mom and dad? He thought in amazement. Come home, Chigani, said the voice again. Home, thought Chigani warmly. And with that, his systems shut down completely and he felt nothing more. Welk and Sims skid to a stop next to him and screamed his name. Welk dropped to his knees and examined the lion thoroughly, but found him to be non-functional and not responsive. Chigani! Chigani! Can you hear me? Shouted Welk. But the lion didn't move. Welk could feel fear welling up in his heart. We need to do something for him. Sergeant. Find a repair kit, or a spare power source, a diagnostic unit, or something, he cried. Sims knelt down next to the lion and studied his broken, fractured body shell. He then leaned down and put an ear next to a hole in the lion's armor. But he heard nothing, and saw nothing, save only for a small curl of smoke wafting up out of the crack. He sighed and looked at Welk, who immediately knew what the prognosis was. Chigani was gone, and there was nothing he could do about it. No. There has to be something we can do, cried Welk. Sims sighed. I don't think there is, he said sadly. Welk's lips began to quiver as tears filled his eyes. He then grabbed Chigani around the neck, buried his face in the lion's thick, dirty mane, and wept.